Oh, it is definitely good to be back. Hello interwebs and welcome to my review of the latest Star Trek show to grace our screens, the series premiere episode 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks, the first animated Star Trek show since Star Trek the Animated Series ended in, 1973? I don't remember. But we finally have a new Star Trek show, everybody. I am so excited. I am so ready to be here with you to talk about it, to rant about it, and to talk about whether it was good or not. It feels good after everything that has happened between when Star Trek Picard went off the air and now. Just so much has happened in the world, and it's just nice to be able to jump back into a Star Trek show, and a Star Trek show that I will say is probably the most optimistic, most joyful of all this era of modern Trek. As much as I love Discovery and Picard, this definitely feels the most optimistic, most joyful, most energetic Star Trek that we've gotten probably ever. But what did I actually think of Lower Decks, the series premiere episode? Well, I know a lot of you out there have either not seen the episode because you just haven't had the time yet and are just curious to see whether you should take the time to jump into the series, or you are unfortunately not in the United States and don't have access to Star Trek Lower Decks just yet because CBS hasn't been able to work out the international air dates yet, which is unfortunate, and I'm very sorry that all of you can't enjoy this alongside us. But because of that, I am going to do the opening part of this review spoiler-free. I mean, this show is a little less reliant on spoilers and more just getting into the thick of it, but I'll try not to spoil much of this plot up front in my videos, and I'll be doing that for all my reviews going forward for Lower Decks, and then once we get into Discovery as well. So don't worry, if you just want to hear my initial impressions of the show and each episode, you can get that without being spoiled when you actually sit down to watch it, and then we'll talk full spoilers, and I'll give a warning then. So, what did I think of Star Trek Lower Decks, the very first episode, and really just kind of the feeling of the series overall? Well, I have to say, I loved it. This show feels like exactly the kind of show that I have really always kind of wanted from Star Trek. I think the trailers for Star Trek Lower Decks actually really did the show a disservice because it made it feel like a very over-the-top jokey show, like one where there's like a joke every second. It's super irreverent to Star Trek and doesn't really care much about Star Trek or Star Trek canon, that it's just kind of playing fast and loose with what Star Trek is. This show is not that. If that was your main concern going into Lower Decks, this show is not that show. I was kind of expecting it, but I was honestly a little bit surprised that this show, as I watched Lower Decks in this first episode, it really felt like it could have slotted into Star Trek canon very easily. Like, it feels like every character, everything in this world feels very Star Trek and feels very true to what Star Trek is. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of irreverency in it, but never in a way that is disrespectful to Trek, nor in a way that really breaks what Star Trek is. And in fact, a lot of the irreverency is kind of leaning into and paying and sending up homage to what Star Trek is. I mean, there's so many jokes in this that are just like reveling in the joy of the weirdness and odd specificity of the Star Trek world, like dealing with the holodecks, or dealing with, I guess second contact, as is the case with this, dealing with like first contact or meeting an alien species, and all those tropes that we all kind of like joke about with Star Trek, and joking about them along with us as fans and in the world, but doing so in a way that doesn't feel like it breaks it or ruins it, but just sort of says like, yeah, this is a part of this world, and gosh, it's weird and silly sometimes, but man, is it not absolutely fun. Like, one quick thing, and this isn't a super spoiler, but there's a huge big event that happens in this episode. Like, this whole thing happens on the ship, and it's treated just like a weekly thing on the ship. Like, the characters are just like, yeah, this is an important situation, but they're not like overly concerned. They're not like, oh my gosh, this is the biggest thing. It's just like, yeah, this happens pretty much every week, because as we know as Star Trek fans, stuff like this pretty much does happen every week. It's a weekly show, so this crazy, weird sci-fi stuff is a sort of daily concern. It's not a over-the-top concern. It's a, when crazy, weird stuff happens, that's just what it is, and we are dealing with it as effective Starfleet crew members, but it's not something like, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world, oh my gosh, this is something crazy new. It's just a weekly occurrence. The other thing I'll say about this spoiler-free before I get into my specific thoughts on it is this episode is very efficient in its setting up what this series is going to be. This episode is more focused on trying to give us the conceit of this show. Like, this is a TNG style show that is focused on the Lower Decks characters, and then giving us a little bit of a taste for who each character is. Like, coming out of this episode, for the four main characters of this show, Boimler, Mariner, Tendi, and then I forget his name, the cyborg guy. I'll look it up in a second. For all four main characters, I pretty much have at least a concept of their personality and what their character arcs are going to be throughout the series, and sort of what issues and personality traits we'll be dealing with them, which is super great and super effective for a pilot to give us all of that in 22 minutes. It makes each character feel unique and distinct. It's very, very efficient in that way, in ways that, like, something like the 2-hour pilot of Star Trek The Next Generation had 2 hours, and even in those 2 hours, it really didn't make us understand who each character was in that pilot episode. I mean, we kind of got Picard, we kind of got Data, and we kind of got a little bit of Riker, and actually the character with the most characterization in that episode was Q. With Lower Decks, I know every character, and the only characters I don't really know fully are the senior staff, and I think that that's kind of part of the point of the show, is that we're not focusing on those characters. I won't sit here and say this is the best Star Trek pilot ever yet. I mean, I'd have to think about it, but it certainly is the most efficient in writing. So anyone who tells you, like, oh, this show is a mess in writing capability, I don't think they watched this show, because it really just felt so efficient in really getting me to understand this crew and these characters just instantaneously. And I think one of the ways it does that super well is just showing that all these characters are just hyper efficient nerds, and that's kind of what you need to be in Star Trek. I mean, you know, I don't want to do too much comparing to the Orville here, because there's clearly some similarities in sort of comedic Star Trek-like show between Lower Decks and the Orville, but I think there's an interesting thing to be said about those shows where in the Orville, there's a lot of characters in the Orville. Like, clearly some characters know their stuff and are competent, but there's a lot of characters in the Orville where I'm like, how did you get your job? Like, for example, the pilot of the show who on the Orville, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but the pilot of the Orville, he's clearly like, he's, you know, kind of the jokester, trickster character, and you're like, how are you competent enough to be the pilot of a ship this size? It doesn't feel like you should have that job, and that's by no means a problem with the show. That's just the tone that the show is going for. But it doesn't necessarily feel like it would be realistic within the world of the show if the show is taking itself that seriously. But here on Star Trek Lower Decks, all of the characters, while they are certainly heightened and over the top in a few ways, they all feel like they could fit in this world. Like, I feel like I could have met a character like Mariner or Boimler or Tendi in an actual episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine or Voyager. Sure, they're a little bit heightened because this is animation and everything is a little bit dialed up a little bit more than it should be, or it would be in a sort of a realistic setting, and that's just the kind of the nature of this style of animation. But I will say that all of these characters just feel like they fit in this universe and don't break it. Unlike the Orville, and again, this is not a hating on the Orville, just two different distinct styles. Unlike the Orville, where I don't really buy that world necessarily as a world that follows the same logic as our world, where this episode of TNG in Lower Decks, through Lower Decks, I can still buy fits in the world of Star Trek and The Next Generation and feels, again, heightened, but still feels like it could be something based in reality. But that's all of my spoiler-free thoughts on this show, so if you have not watched the first episode of Lower Decks and don't want to be spoiled, you can stop right here. I totally understand. Leave a comment. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you subscribe to this channel for more Star Trek Lower Decks reviews. But let's get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty and a little bit more of my specific thoughts on Second Contact, the first episode of Lower Decks. All right, getting into my spoiler section, like I was talking about with earlier on in this video in my non-spoiler section, I really loved all of these characters, and I really feel like I got a taste of every single character on this show. Boimler feels like he's that, I'm the Star Trek character who wants to become a commander one day. I want to toe the line. I want to know all the regulations. In many ways, he actually feels like a somewhat more stuck-up version of Tilly from Star Trek Discovery, a character who really wants to is so focused on the captain's path. That's what they want. But much more stuck up and kind of a little bit full of himself in a way that some Star Trek characters can be full of themselves. I mean, look at Captain Picard. If you can't meet a more person kind of full of himself than Picard in the early seasons of TNG, I don't know who lost the thread there, but you know what I'm saying. So I understand his deal. Mariner, I really, really get too, especially with the twist at the end of the episode that the captain is her mother. I kind of called it earlier when the captain asked Boimler to look in on her, but I really liked that sort of surprise twist about this character that wasn't really revealed before this episode came out, that Mariner is the child of the captain of the Cerritos and an admiral, a very successful admiral. So I like that dynamic of this. Mariner is a character who is clearly competent, clearly knows her stuff, and has been raised in a family that, a military family that knows their stuff, but in a way that's kind of put a chip on her shoulder. She's competent. She knows what she's doing, but she's bucking authority, and she doesn't know how to fit into this world. Her heart is in the right place, as we see in the storyline where she wants to give farming equipment and just undercut Starfleet bureaucracy to give these people in the second contact that they're giving farming equipment, but she doesn't necessarily know how to do so in a way that is respectful or true to Starfleet spirit. And there's a little bit of like the rebellious Ensign Ro in her that I really, really, really liked. And it surprised me because it makes her probably one of the most intriguing and my favorite characters so far on the show. And I knew I was going to like Mariner, but I did not expect her to be my favorite character going into the show. I was actually expecting to like Tendi more. And I do love Tendi. I'll talk about her in a second. But I really liked how Mariner just, you can clearly see how she and Boimler are going to bounce off of each other and make each other better. And that's kind of like what Star Trek is all about, like characters making each other better. So I can clearly see the flaws with Boimler kind of being full of himself, kind of being stuck up and kind of only seeing what the rule book allows him to see, but also knowing how to fit into this world of Starfleet and fit into the world of Star Trek in general. And how Mariner is a character who knows how to get stuff done. She is much more competent, much more aware of her surroundings, and much more able to actually deal with the crisis at hand in a very cogent way. But she doesn't know how to fit into this world really well. And I can just see that the pairing of her and Boimler are really going to bounce off of each other really, really incredibly well. And I think that that's a great character dynamic for your two leads. It's by no means like revolutionizing everything. Like I've definitely seen this kind of dynamic before, especially in comedy. But I really like seeing it here. I think it works well. And I like that it's you can clearly see the arc about how these two characters are going to make each other better, which is clearly just a Star Trek thing. They're not going to make each other worse. They're only going to improve each other and make each other better by colliding with each other, which I think is great. Jumping into the other characters, Tendi, I really, really loved. I mean, they talked about this in the interviews before about this character, but she feels, again, like the Star Trek nerd who happens to live in the Star Trek world. Like, she's just super overexcited about everything, and I just loved her enthusiasm for everything. There's this one great moment where she's pumping someone's heart to keep him alive, that moment from the trailer, and it keeps going a little bit where, like, the guy's like, oh, my heart hurts every time you pump it, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry, and then at the end of the episode, she's just, like, so excited about it. She's like, yeah, I got to hold the heart. There's nothing can phase her kind of character, and I just love that sort of innocence in her and just excitement at the world her in, because that's how I would be if I got to be in Star Trek. I'd be so excited to just be in the middle of it, even if things are insane and crazy. The one character, the cyborg character, whose name I'm blanking on, I really did like, and I'm trying to remember what his name was. He was the one that I kind of got the least awareness of, and that wasn't to say he was bad, but he is the one that I sort of got the least into. Rutherford, that's his name. I wrote it down. He's the one that I kind of got the least awareness of, but again, I still got enough of him. I loved his storyline of him going on a date and him being a cyborg and him kind of like having like sort of problems with the cyborg, and we got like jokes about the Vulcan implant. And I just loved the payoff at the end of the episode of him not getting the girl because she just didn't get like engineering stuff, and he's just the super nerd engineer that just knows all this engineering stuff, and that's what's important to him. And I love the payoff with Tendi, that Tendi's like, oh yeah, I totally get you. I'm super excited about that too. Just that little twist on her character, and you can kind of see that this little buildup of maybe Tendi and Rutherford are going to be bouncing off of each other, and maybe starting a romance there. We'll sort of see how that goes, but I like that little hint of the character arc for the two of them there, how they'll sort of slot into place really, really well. And I really loved the plot of this episode too. As I was talking about earlier on, this feels like this episode was just a send-up of Star Trek tropes. We get this sort of two ideas. One was the zombie attack on the ship where the command staff definitely got infected by like a zombie rage virus from the planet, and everything's going crazy on the ship, and everyone's sort of trying to get to the rallying point. But I liked how, as I was saying, it's very understated by the actual characters in the show. Like, characters just effectively go into action, and it feels every day, and like they're even still continuing their date. And again, it's kind of playing off that idea of like, this is a weekly kind of occurrence. Like, crazy stuff like this is dangerous, and we definitely need to take it seriously, but it's also weekly. It's a thing that happens every other week, and that's, again, fits into what we know of Star Trek because we watched the show weekly. So we knew these things had to happen basically every week to fit into that world. And so I kind of liked that sort of sending up of that. And I really liked the other story, too, with Mariner going to give the farming equipment to the people. And I could totally understand that situation too, of like Starfleet probably has a ton of bureaucracy around giving technology to these people because, first contact, we don't want to give them technology beyond their control. And so I just liked that Mariner was just like, screw that, I'm just going to give these people what they need because they need it. And just understanding that. And that's a clearly, like, that is a core Star Trek sort of idea. And I like how she just sort of bypasses it and just says, no, this is the right thing to do. Screw the, second contact rule and second contact bureaucracy. It felt like it wasn't breaking the rules of Star Trek, but really sending them up and paying homage to them in a really fun, distinct way. I think the only characters that I really didn't get a feel for in this episode, in a little way, was the command staff. But I think that's kind of the point. As I was saying before, there's, there are characters that are supposed to be in the background, as ensigns in the original series were in the background of that show, of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. And so I feel like they're meant to be somewhat tropey. Like, Ransom clearly is like a Commander Riker type, kind of like, I want to do battle with things, and, I'm the commander. Didn't pick up on her name, but the cat lady, the medical officer, she clearly is very Bones-esque, like she has a very dry sense of humor and sort of a little bit rubs you the wrong way, like McCoy kind of did at times. Doesn't necessarily have the best bedside manner, I guess is the best way to put it. Or the Doctor from Voyager would probably also be a good analog as well to that character, or Pulaski as well. Actually, very Pulaski-esque if I'm actually really thinking about it. The only character that I really got a little hint for was the captain, mostly because she definitely has the most intriguing relationship with our main crew. By being the mother of Mariner and kind of using Boimler to try and spy on her daughter. And then we get this like interesting arc where the mother doesn't really fully accept Mariner. The captain doesn't really fully appreciate who her daughter is. And again, I can see that being a wonderful arc going forward, and I think that will be an interesting dynamic playing forward. I think the only dynamic that I really didn't get in this episode is I'm not entirely sure. I got how Mariner and Boimler bounce off each other, and Tendi and Rutherford bounce off of each other a little bit, but I didn't really get how those two groups, the Mariner and Boimler, how they sort of interact with each other. Like, I can see that they're friends, but I'm curious to see how, like, Tendi reacts with Boimler, or Tendi reacts with Mariner, or Rutherford acts with Mariner and Boimler, so that sort of thing. But again, it's a pilot, it's first episode, I can't expect everything in it. What I got is great, and so I'm just curious to see how those dynamics will be built out going forward. So yeah, I mean, 22-minute episode, 26-minute episode of Star Trek that felt like it hit everything a Star Trek episode had. It had the big adventure action. It gave me a good character drama, and it set up these characters really effectively, and yet also managed to be incredibly funny. Like, I didn't even touch upon all the jokes in this episode. There's so many jokes that I thought were really, really funny, but there's also enough meat on the bones of the characters and plot and story going on here and character dynamics that I don't even need to mention the jokes. Like, I was actually worried going into these reviews. Like, I was worried, it's like, oh, I might have to talk about the comedy. And not that I can't talk about comedy, but I'm much more interested in talking about character arcs and plots and things like that. That's just kind of the reviewer I am. And watching this, I think I have nothing to worry about because there's plenty of meat on these bones, even if you're not someone who wants the comedic elements of Star Trek. You could still watch this show and still feel like you're getting your Star Trek experience, your Star Trek The Next Generation experience, more specifically, even beyond the jokes. And then the jokes are just like gravy on the cake, was the metaphor that I was about to use. Do I put gravy on cakes? What did I just say? Why did I say that? I don't know. Icing on the cake, gravy on the mashed potatoes, if you want that, or gravy on your cake. I'm not here to judge you. But I think that the jokes really are just an extra nice little layer on all of this. But it still feels like, at its core, a Star Trek show. It really feels just like a Next Generation episode, like Lower Decks, with more jokes in it. And that's wonderful. So I really, really enjoyed Lower Decks. I'm so excited to be watching the show, and I'm so excited to have Star Trek back. I really was thinking like this was going to be something that I was just going to enjoy until we got to Discovery. But honestly, I'm just excited to watch more Lower Decks. I can't wait for next week. So, yeah, what did all of you think? Did you like Star Trek Lower Decks? That's enough of me ranting. Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel because I have a ton of Star Trek content and other content and discussions of geek and pop culture and all that fun stuff. I do podcasts as well. I do What the Frel with Council of Geeks, where we rewatch episodes of Farscape. So check out What the Frel on your podcast service of choice. Or you can, if you want more comedy from me, I do a Star Trek RPG podcast called Star Trek Behind the Lines, where it's a little bit more PG-13, R-rated sort of humor Star Trek RPG show. It's a lot of fun. Again, you can find it on your podcast feeds or the actual video version over on Lore Reloaded's channel. But regardless of if you subscribe, you comment, you listen to my podcast, you even liked this review, I'm just glad that you stopped by and hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, and a special thank you to Piston Twisted Garage, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Miranda Janelle, Eli Bergmas, Ashlyn Solstice, Christina Dalliance, Greg Gillum, Munir Amlani, Boyd and Marybeth Earl, Wayne Twitchell, Alexander Miller, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, Randy Thompson, Mouse Pounder, Jemshin, Susan Banks, Wellington Marcus, Lorena Mesa, Mari Neckar, John Stell, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, William Stewart, Jason Knott, Maeve, Stephen Clinard, Zach Cody, Subraxis, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Dante St. James, Gretchen Badger, Polly Mina, Din Hagney, and Bree Beecher. Thank you so much to all of you. I could not do this without you, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.